Hey folks, what's up? Here is Rauta and yet another annoying, opinion video of sorts. Now, this is mostly about us older folks, older generation, older metalheads, or music fans just in general. And maybe this is some words of wisdom or just random thoughts, ponderings to you, younger generation. Or in case you're older, you probably know what I'm gonna talk about. Why music tends to suck more when you get older. Now, I know it sounds like a very negative start. So let's start this way. How come it's harder to like new music as much as it was back in, teenage years, kids, or early adults, adolescents, whatever? Now, that's a tricky question, which I keep asking myself all over again after a few years, after years, after years. And it kind of came to my mind recently when a friend of mine, a musician whose band's retrospective I recently went through, came here to as a comment, YouTube comments, and asked me pretty much like, can you even enjoy music as a music reviewer? And I'm like, yeah, of course. But I mean, it gets harder over the years. If I didn't enjoy music all the time and, had the interest towards finding new good bands, new good albums and so forth, why the fuck I would spend my time, going through these review albums, especially when most of them are not gonna be something like I put in my record collection. Actually, I think I've been cutting my record collection a little bit, but then again, every year I put a few records in, so probably it's growing slowly. But, maybe it's not, but that's barely the point. My point here is, when I was in my teenage years, I was, finding new thrash, death metal, and, black metal bands as well, basically entering these genres. Everything was fascinating. I mean, when the first time I get to hear bands like Slayer or Death, Bolt Thrower. Well, Bolt Thrower doesn't count because I actually heard it a few years earlier, but bands like that in general. It was like, wow, mind-blowing. A lot of these bands were great, except the ones that were not, but usually they were because of some wrong kind of vocal styles. Manowar, or in case of something heavy metal, King Diamond. Well, Manowar is heavy metal as well. The point here is, there were a few bands, obviously, even from the styles or genres I was listening to, that didn't so much as like resonate with instantaneously. Of course, there are more bands than those two, but just as an example, yeah, when you are conquering new lands, that is genres or bands, for the first time, it's gonna be mind-blowing experience. Now, I didn't like, for instance, black metal vocals when I for the first time heard black metal. I was like, oh, I want death metal growlies, or at least some kind of a thrash metal grunting, whatever it is called. And as such, it was like, I like the music, and I like the ideology, lyrics, and, the visuals, but I didn't like the stuff. But when I eventually started liking them, it was like a huge new chapter was taken, and a lot of bands for me to find and fall in love with. Now, obviously, the same thing was with death metal and thrash metal, heavy metal, and beyond. Well, obviously, there were music styles, bands and music styles I didn't like so much, like, never actually got to, like, say, power metal. But, beat makes it so, nobody likes every genre. There is no single people who is like everything from, this or that. But the point here is, early years, it's easy to like every band. It's easy to keep high scores even if you would be doing reviews and all, because everything is magical. And I know this from my first-hand experience as well, from a lot of younger generation. They find something like Horna for the first time and they're like, wow, Horna is my favorite band. All their albums are 10 out of 10. Now, I'm not gonna fully question that, but I kind of do, because everything needs to be questioned. I mean, the point here is, when you're teenage years or your early 20s, a lot of those bands you just found out about are gonna sound like magical. A lot of them are gonna like I'm gonna take my money, and you're like flipping the cash out of your hands and like that. You could just buy the whole fucking record store if it was humanly possible. Luckily it isn't, because later on you start questioning your own choices. This also happened to me, and actually within a few years. No, I'll give you a good example. So, I got my first CD player in 1993. And of course it was fantastic times, because suddenly I could have a little bit of my student money spent on CDs, not just tapes, and then copy something from my friends. I didn't even have too many tapes. I mean, I didn't come surely from a rich family or anything like that. So I was pretty much repeating the same old tapes with only a handful of, albums, back and forth, back and forth. So I was basically spending a lot of time with, say, early Metallica albums. And then there are a few others, but not worth mentioning too many. So, 1993, when I got the CD player, I would be buying those full price CDs because first of all, I didn't know about tape trading. So the only tapes I was getting were my friends. So it was an expensive hobby in a way. And, then I would be buying CDs from bands I had never heard before, except when I'm going to the local record store, and I would be listening, giving a song or go and put my headphones on at the store. Oh, this sounds fantastic. I'm going to buy this one. And sooner or later, sometimes you make a mistake. By mistake, I mean at home you're giving another spin to this album and you're like, man, did I just waste my money on something that isn't that good? For example, I remember this was 93 or 94. Dark Tranquillity's Skydancer debut album. After a while, I was like, man, this is probably not my cup of tea. And it actually sounded a lot like black metal, back in days anyway. You had the screaming vocals, even if the riffs were a little bit different, but not that different. But eventually you would give it spin after spin after spin, and you kind of started learning to like it. So there it was in your record collection, and you were a happy batcher, finding more cool new bands. Dark Tranquillity was one of them, In Flames and the likes. Yeah, sure, why not? And then obviously there were some other bands which just made it to the compilation, which I would later on feel like, hey, I'm going to sell this away. One of the weird mistakes I was finding in, Suicidal Tendencies. I got some Suicidal Tendencies back in like early 90s, and by 1993 or whatever, I was buying some of them as CDs because, hey, that was my selected format. So by 1996, I had already like, hey, I'm getting, over this band because, it was all death metal, all black metal, and barely no other genres made it to my collection. It was small still, but, way bigger than, say, 3 years earlier. So I actually traded them away or sold whatever, and only to regret it a few years later. This is one of the very, very few mistakes I consider doing when I have been, selling CDs off my collection or trading them for something else. Obviously, most of the albums I have traded away or sold and later on revisited are like, yeah, I remember why I sold it away years and years ago. Sometimes I've been getting back to certain albums 20 years later only to find out like, why on earth did I like this particular album in 1996 or 1997? Whatever it was. That's barely the point. The point here is, it's easier to love some new music when you're not that experienced. It's a virgin territory, like almost literally. And you're like just wandering through these different landscapes. Everything is magical. To put it in a kind of an analog way, or weird metaphors, whatever. You're entering this weird land for the first time. Oh, you see these magical forests, thinking like traveling to some kind of a Lord of the Rings fantasy world. And you're like, oh, these waterfalls, oh, these deserts, oh, these Arctic icy plains and all that stuff. You're just, oh man, I want to have it everything. And you're like almost in the position you want to take thousands of photos. Because it's all that virgin territory you're experiencing for the first time. Doesn't matter if it's heat, cold, whatever. It's magical. You would probably see it magical even if some killer spider bit your hand and, oh, for the first time, oh, I cannot kill this beast because it's something for the first time. Now, as you get older and more experienced, you realize that those black metal bands or albums you were so much in love with for the first time and all that stuff, a few years later you kind of realize they were actually B versions of some other bands, and then you're like, do I really need this or that? Oh, let's get rid of it. Or what about this death metal band? Well, I could be instead listening to Bolt Thrower or Morbid Angel. Why do I need that? Now, maybe this kind of comparison doesn't really need to be in place. Maybe you could just store it all. But there's two reasons why you don't do it. First of all, in the end, at some point, you will run out of space. Especially when you're moving houses, which I did a lot when I was younger. Every year or two you would move house. So at some point you're like, why on earth I'm moving these particular CDs, which I don't even like? I want to get rid of them. So for example, for me, around 1998, I decided to get rid of pretty much all of my tapes. I feel that format was obsolete and I didn't even want to listen to them. I only saved those certain copies where I had put my own work in them, like doing a layout for some demo or having my own music on another or whatever. So tapes were gone, and pretty much that, getting rid of those CDs, which I didn't like so much, had already started. Maybe around 96, I don't remember the exact year. And then, much like tape trading happened, you trade certain CDs. I think it was Tiamat's Wild Honey, which I traded, I think, for a Mysticum album back in the days. I'm not exactly 100% sure if it was this CD for that, but something like that happened. And while I did love Wild Honey album a lot when it came out, it was really a magical experience. I never looked back, because what I got in trade is still in my CD collection. I still love the album so much. So yeah, good trades were done. Some people just felt different about this or that, and that's how trades happen. And also, when I've been revisiting some of the albums, are kind of giving me the nostalgic vibe. So for a while, I'm like, yeah, this kind of is cool, and then I figure out, no. With recent years, especially when I became a review dude around 2002, I started getting so many CDs. Eventually figured out I would even have no place to store them, nor would I want, because I was already getting pickier. The more you review, the more picky you become. I mean, the more you realize what's the difference between great, good, decent, and mediocrity. And anything less of mediocrity is basically considered trash. Now, I'm going to put it this way. Some people are like, hey, but even decent or even semi-good albums, I mean, they're not bad at all. You can really have a rating 1 to 0, 100, 1 to 10, 1 to 5, whatever. I mean, why would you be so much like all albums are bad? But let's go into dual mode, the kind of a black and white mode, which has its place in the world, even if it in most things it doesn't make any sense. But we're talking about kind of a duality, buy choices in a way. When it's about buying a CD or vinyl for that matter, doesn't matter. You either buy it or you don't. There is no middle path. So in that sense, you only have two ratings. It's good enough for your money or it isn't. Nowadays it's of course different, because every music, all the music pretty much, not everything but a lot of them, is on YouTube or other streaming services. So you kind of can have it, in a different ways, like something that you would listen to because it's so fucking great and spend your money on it. Something that you would listen to but definitely not buy it. And then there's the third class, which is just considered trash. Doesn't matter whether you give it 1 out of 5 or 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. If it's not worth your time to listen to, it's kind of a considered crap. Even if it's mediocrity in your own terms for describing music and all. Obviously, once again, we are talking about the wider scope when we're talking about review scores, but this video is not about that. The point here is, the older you get, the more picky you will be, the more critical you will be, the more selective you will be. Why? Because you eventually realize you are a mortal man or woman or whatever in that case, and you realize your time is kind of limited, especially when you are suddenly a working class citizen. You have to have the work, the family time, and the hobbies and whatever. And you realize there is no time anymore to listen 16 hours a day music. The only thing when you're not listening to music is when you're sleeping. So the less you have time to listen to music, the more picky you will most likely come. And the same is then again reflected. I mean, if you don't believe me, think it like that. How many bands you actually consider seeing live? How many are that worthy that you were spending literally hundreds of euros or dollars or English pounds for that matter to travel to see them live? Yeah, take this as a point. I mean, it's easy to say, I like this band so much, it's definitely worth a YouTube click or two. Yeah, sure, but that doesn't cost you anything. That doesn't even require you anything. But would you say it's worth 100 euros to travel to different cities, set up the train or bus schedules, or take your own car, drive a couple of hours, then spend $50 or euros on the ticket, a couple on the beer, then drive back home? You get the point. And then actually, there are not too many bands you are really ready to do that. Some people obviously don't even like live music, so this example is not good for everybody, but you get the point. And I've noticed the same sentiment with a lot of people when they're getting older. It's like they're not getting any more as many CDs or vinyl or whatever as they get older, unless they're collecting items, in which case they are kind of special people, and probably in a good sense. But once again, then it's not so much about given musical qualities or being favorite bands. It's just, kind of a hobby. You want to invest your hard-earned money to something you find it's supporting the bands and, keeping the spirit, the collective, the whole fucking clan alive. By clan, I mean really the bigger tribe known as black metal scene or whatever your scene is. But it is kind of a shame that I find harder and harder to find those next 5 out of 5 albums. Back in the 90s it was easy. Pretty much all my favorites, and this is kind of the scary part, all my favorites, which are like the 10 out of 10 albums or 5 out of 5, doesn't matter what the scale is, they're pretty much all from the 80s or 90s. I could name a few from the 80s, like the Wasp's second album and so forth. I could name a lot of albums from the 90s which are my favorites. Like Death Symbolic or Hammerheart and Twilight of the Gods from Bathory, a couple of albums from Dark Throne, Dissection, Storm of the Lightsbane, those kind of albums. And then I really thinking about it and getting cold sweat, I'm like, fuck, that was more than 30 years ago, or at least that 30 years ago. And I'm like, so where are the good albums? Is it just because my age, or isn't that kind of music anymore done? I get the same kind of complaints to a lot of people. Nobody makes those great albums again. All black metal is shit. All death metal is shit. All thrash metal is... And the list goes on. I don't believe that. I don't buy it. But in a way, I am kind of agreeing with them. I'm saying there are a bunch of 8 out of 10 albums. There are few 9 out of 10s. But what about the 10s? Yeah, pretty much left in the 80s and 90s. So are you feeling old, Grandpa? Yeah, sure. I don't want to even admit it to myself or to you, dear people. But that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm saying it gets harder to really, really, really find that teenage love when you get older. And that's the bum side of being older. Now that you would have the money and you would have the knowledge to find all these cool bands, you don't give a shit anymore, at least that much. Back in the days, you kind of begged you had the money and skill and knowledge and all about the bands. You could travel to different world to see the different bands and different gigs, different venues, festivals, whatever. And yet you didn't because you're young. So the saying, youth is wasted on the young or youth. Yeah, it really rings a bell. I mean, there's some truth to it. So I guess this is more like those random ponderings. I don't know if it resonates with every and each individual right there on the other side of camera or screen. But it's worth thinking. Do you still like the music the same ways when you were a teenager or 20s? Or if you are in your teenager years or 20s, are you even afraid of this? I mean, don't be. Get the CDs, get the vinyl or the tapes or whatever you want. Or if you don't give a shit about physical products, if you're modern, evolution, new generation and don't give a shit about physical products, then don't do it. But my point here is support a band if you think it's worth your time. Buy a shirt. This was actually a gift though. Go to see them live and enjoy the music while you still have the passion and possibility. Some bands eventually stop doing those trips or eventually you will get bored of them. So why not tap to the passion while you still have it? So when the favorite band comes to near you, go to see it, because in 10 years' time you might be either too busy, too bored, too boring, or just dead, or at least deaf. So there you have it. Now off you go, random ranting. This is Rauta. Off you go, and remember to like and subscribe. I was told I need to remind people of that, so subscribe. Bye bye.